this summer, General Heritage asked me to take a look at opportunities to utilize the museum as a basis for a series of PMEs that could capitalize on lessons learned from history as a means of application to thinking about who we are as Marines today and where we're going as a Marine Corps. So for many of you in the room, and it's a small group, but that's all right, you're in for a treat of a PME, and this is an exceptional one. When you take a look at what the Commandant is up to today in terms of a drive towards the concepts of the Marine Corps operating concept itself, Future Force 2025, he's challenging senior leadership, but really Marines at all grades, to think about where we are right now and where we need to go. If you look historically through the history of the Marine Corps, we, like the rest of our sister services in DoD, have, in a very slow sort of way, cyclically gone through a series of resets. We get blooded up front. You can take just about every conflict we've been in, and then we adapt to the enemy and its TTPs on the battlefield. We're now today, in my opinion, facing changes like we've never historically seen before, especially on the technological side. If you take a look at F-35 as an example, a platform is a sensor for us, and the amount of information, both targeting and intel, that system produces, how are we adapting as a force to even receive the information that platform can produce? If you take a look at the last 18 years of combat, a lot of very, very asymmetric, point-oriented in its nature, yet moving out there are conventional threats from the Chinese and Russians, kind of historical in nature. How are we as a service adapting ourselves to those changing requirements, both today if we were to deploy and in the future? How are we thinking downrange? Well, again, where I see history is applicable to us as a means by which we can take a look at very hard lessons learned in the past, hence the topic itself, heritage and hard lessons, and apply them to our own thought process. This is not just a senior leaders issue, this is for all of us, as many of the younger Marines in the room are at some point those future leaders who will implement the thoughts that we're applying today. What I'd like to do then is transition those thoughts, why are you here, to who we've got with us today. Retired Lieutenant Colonel Pete Owen works currently today for the Department of Homeland Security, but is one of the Marine Corps' touch points, foremost historians, and especially in relation to this particular topic, Marines in the Great War. And I know just about everybody that's involved in this topic, few that have a greater degree of knowledge than Pete. Pete's been around the Marine Corps since he enlisted back in 1981, transitioned into an opportunity to attend the Naval Academy, and then went on to a career as an infantry officer. Combat deployments in 91, Desert Shield, Desert Storm, and then again in 2003 with RCT-1 as a regimental XO, where our paths crossed. I served as a battalion OPSO in that RCT for the push up to Baghdad. Multiple degrees over that period of time, including pursuit of a doctorate today. The Marine Corps looks to Pete as our resident expert on this particular topic. The book that he's written, To the Limit of Endurance, is a story about 2-6 and its entry into World War I and its adaptation to the challenges of a fairly seasoned enemy on the ground in northeast France. For the docents in the room, they know, and I've said it, I've been to Bellawood 7 times, and every one of those trips over, I've had Pete's book, which is now getting beat down and weathered, in my hand as the Bible of reference for how to walk that ground and what to look for. Without any further ado, Pete, I turn it over to you for round 2 this afternoon. Again, I would challenge you as Pete gets into his discussions, not just the history of it, and it's a challenge at times to get people interested in history, but to think of it in terms of its application to who we are as Marines today. This is the Smedley v. Butler PME series. It's the first of our PMEs in that series, and each of them will build off of these sorts of concepts. Without any further ado, Pete, all yours. Enjoy this PME.
All right, thanks, Joe. Cole Russo, Marines, Friends of the Museum, Marine Corps. It's very humbling for me to stand up here before you today and get an opportunity to talk about the Marine Corps. It's also humbling for me to be the spokesperson for the First World War Marines. They endured and they sacrificed so much in such a very violent and short period. And for me to be able to stand and affiliate myself with their legacy is pretty humbling. So I'm going to try and do justice both to the time and effort that you've allocated to get me here and to get yourself here, and also to what they accomplished and how they deserve to be remembered. There's no sight in all the pageant of war like young trained men going up to battle. The columns look solid and businesslike. They go on like a river that flows very deep and strong. Uniforms are drab these days, but there are points of light on the helmets and the bayonets, and light in the quick, steady eyes and the brown young faces greatly daring. Every file knows that a great many more are going in and will come out again, but that goes along with the job, and they have no illusions about the job. Almost exactly 100 years ago, these 196 Marines from the 79th Company, what would become Company F, 2nd Battalion, 6th Marines, assembled for this group portrait at Quantico, Virginia. They had just formed up as a brand new rifle company for the Marine Corps. And they formed up again about 18 months later in Germany after the end of the war. And there were only 32 of them left. Those two pictures tell a powerful story, or at least they imply there's a powerful story to be told. And I'm going to try and do justice to that over the next hour. Now, the quote that I read to you just a few moments ago was written by this fellow. That's John W. Thompson. He was a captain in the First World War, a lieutenant when it started, and he fought at Belleau Wood. He earned the Navy Cross during the fighting in World War I. And you probably have heard of him from his books, Fixed Bayonets, from which I drew that quotation. Fixed Bayonets is an incredible work of literature. If you're a Marine and you haven't read his book, I'll tell you, I think you're professionally illiterate. You need to pick up a copy and find out what he's about. He was an incredible artist, a writer, a journalist, but he was also an historian. And he wrote about the history of the Marine Corps at Belleau Wood as an official historian, as one of the Marine officers assigned to a team of Army and Marine Corps officers in Fort McNair who were supposed to write a history of the battle. He was an incredibly thorough and honest and rigorous historian. He actually traveled to Germany to look at German archives of the battle to make sure that he was telling both sides of the story. As a former journalist, as a person of honor and an intellectual rigor, he started in his assessment to identify that some of the conduct or the performance of the senior Army and Marine officers at Belleau Wood probably deserved a great deal of criticism. And he got a lot of pushback from the people who were running the project. So he resigned, and the history of this battle that they were working on never got published. He drafted his own manuscript. It never got published in his lifetime, but in 2006, a Marine historian and a World War II era veteran named George Clark got it published under the title The United States Army, 2nd Division, northwest of Chateau Thierry in World War I. So what I'm going to try and do today is be loyal to John W. Thompson and his legacy, the legacy that he explains and describes so vividly in Fixed Bayonets, but also the hard lessons that go along with it that we have to be honest about, that he describes in his second book. Now, this is what the Marine Corps was doing best prior to World War I. What you see here is a picture of the 8th Company. The companies were numbered back then for administrative purposes because they'd operate independently of battalions. So the 8th Company here in this picture is in the Dominican Republic. It's a combat photo. They're in a straight skirmish line. They're in the kneeling position. They're firing rifles. And the way the Marine Corps envisioned itself fighting prior to World War I was that our superior marksmen, who were more disciplined than our opponents and better shooters than our opponent, could easily overwhelm our opponents with fire superiority and movement. It was a very simple construct, and it was suitable for the small wars that the Marine Corps was engaged in during this period. Well, here's another picture of the same company about 3 years later. This is the 8th Company. It's no longer a small company of 50 riflemen. It's a machine gun company. And as the 8th Machine Gun Company has transformed from its pre-war roots, so has the Marine Corps transformed. For instance, at the beginning of the war, when the war was declared, the Marine Corps only had a little bit over almost 14,000 Marines in uniform. Very small, very tiny corps. By the end of the war, there was almost 73,000 Marines. Now, what does this mean? Well, if you're a manpower person, you understand that this means that the Marine Corps went through a 530% increase. If you're a small unit leader, like a company commander, it means that even by the beginning of Belleau Wood, your company, 5 out of 6 of your Marines weren't in uniform 14 months earlier. So just think about that. It's not like today at all. So that's a tremendous readiness problem that you have to overcome. At the same time, you have to recruit those guys. Now, the neat thing was that there was so much enthusiasm for the war that there was waves of volunteers. So the job of a recruiter wasn't to sell people, to convince them into joining the Marines at all. The recruiter's job at this time was to screen the many applicants that were pounding against his door, saying, I want to be one of the Marines. And recruiters probably were turning away about 2 out of every 3 guys that walked in the door and not even allowing them to enlist. So that gave the Marine Corps a huge qualitative advantages, particularly when you compare it to the problems that the Army was experiencing. The Army's expansion dwarfed what we were having to go through. The Army started off with only about 208,000 soldiers and National Guardsmen, part-time guys. By the end of the war, 18 months later, there was 4 million of them. That's a 2,000% increase almost. That means 1 out of every 20 soldiers and National Guardsmen, 1 out of every 20 soldiers had not been, only 1 out of every 20 had been in uniform beginning of the war. Okay, it also meant that they had a draft. And what the draft meant was that as the Army took in all these numbers of people, the ones who had education or leadership experience were all funneled off to officer candidate school. The ones that had some sort of technical vocation or skills, or at least aptitude, were funneled up towards all of their technical specialties, right? Okay, so who was left? Well, the guys that were going into the infantry often were the least poorly educated, like manual laborers or unemployed guys or guys with a whole lot of aptitude to do anything else. So they weren't putting their best people in the infantry. They were doing quite the opposite. And they also weren't consistently attending recruit training. So the Army has horror stories of guys showing up in combat units that are about to go into battle or actually engaged in battle, and they've never even held a rifle before. That's the U.S. Army in World War I, as opposed to the Marine Corps, where everybody who served in the Marine Corps in France saw combat graduated from recruit training, predominantly from Paris Island or Mare Island, which was the West Coast boot camp up in San Francisco Bay at this time. This depot wasn't open yet. So when they graduated, much like today, they'd been there about 10 weeks, and they were physically in pretty good shape. They were very disciplined, just like today, and they could shoot very well, probably even more so on fundamental marksmanship than we teach even today. And Johnny, I'm going to ask to borrow that real quick. Okay, more so than today, the Marine Corps was a rifle organization, and the rifle that we used was the Model 1903 Springfield. It's a 30-06 weapon. It's a bolt action weapon, which I think most of you understand means that you need to clean the rifle. No, I'm just kidding. But anyway, you work the bolt, you put in a magazine of 5 rounds. Every pull of the trigger, you have to work the bolt to chamber another round. It's extremely accurate. In fact, it's so accurate that these guys, I'm stealing my own thunder, I've got slides on it, but they had to qualify at the 600-yard line. You also had this sight would pop up, and you can actually adjust it out to a range of 2,800 yards. Now, the Marine Corps had no expectation that you were going to be hitting point targets at 2,800 yards, but the way they envisioned this working was that your company commander, with his company of just 50 to 100 guys, would have his company online and would see a target out there 1,000, 1,500, 2,000 yards away, like an enemy artillery battery or an enemy infantry formation, and then would use area fire at that distance and shoot a barrage of rifle bullets. That's how the Marine Corps envisioned itself fighting. And so marksmanship. Yeah.
I don't know about in the back, but I could hear you much better without the sound system.
Without the sound system?
Yeah, because you're like muffled.
Can you guys hear me better with the microphone or without in the back? Without? Okay. We can do this.
What's happening is it's in the back until
Yeah.
sound doesn't travel like.
All right. Is it going to mess up your recording if I don't? Okay. All right.
Thank you.
Good to go. Good observation there. All right. So also now they did something different. Now right now you can't graduate from recruit training unless you qualify for rifle. Is that still right? Okay, that's still right. Good. Don't change that. So back then, only in 1917, only 37% of recruit training graduates were qualifying with the rifle. In 1918, it got better to about 67%. But if you went to the 4th Marine Brigade, you qualified at least marksman or higher. Now this is the qualification course, same qualification course the Army was using at that time. Down there, you see they're shooting the 600-yard line. All right, but you also see they have marksmen. The score for that is 202, it looks like. But they also had first class and second class. So you were qualified if you got second class, but you didn't get a badge to wear. But you had to shoot marksman to go to the 4th Marine Brigade. So we had a qualitative edge of Marines coming in because of our recruiting efforts. We have a qualitative edge because they're all graduating recruit training, and we got an even bigger qualitative edge because they're all qualifying at least as marksmen or better. So these are really, really sharp guys that are being sent to France. Now the Marine Corps also has to get officers. The pictures you see here are guys that the Commandant of the Marine Corps obtained because he didn't have officer selection offices. He didn't have an officer candidate school back then, but he had to fill the ranks of the 4th Marine Brigade. He had to get platoon commanders. He had to get a lot of them. So he did something bold and innovative and non-standard. He wrote letters to the superintendents of all the military academies in the country. There were a lot back then. When you see guys here from Virginia Military Institute and Texas A&M, and a place in Indiana called Culver, which no longer exists as a military school. Louisiana State University back then had a very, very big corps of cadets. But also he wrote to places like Yale and Harvard and things like that. And he said, "Dear President of the University, based on your recommendation alone, you send me 10 names, I will commission them as second lieutenants in the Marine Corps as long as they pass the physical." And that's where they got some of the best officers from, honestly, Marine Corps history, just through that immediate need and immediate fix to the problem. Then there's these guys. I'll quote Thomason again here. "There were also a number of diverse people who ran curiously to type, with drilled shoulders and a bone-deep sunburn, and a tolerance sworn of nearly everything on earth. Their speech was flavored with Navy words. Rifles were high and holy things to them, and they knew 5-inch broadside guns. They were the Leathernecks, the old-timers, the old breed of American regular, regarding the service as home and war as an occupation. And they transmitted their temper and character and viewpoint to the high-hearted volunteer mass which filled the ranks of the Marine Brigade." So when they assembled companies like the 79th Company at Quantico in the summer of 1917, you had these train loads of brand new Marines coming up from Paris Island or across the country from Mare Island, and they would form the companies right there at the train depot. And these old-time Leathernecks, and you usually had between 2 and 5 of these guys per company, would form these guys and start instilling them with Marine Corps traditions and values and discipline, and try to train them. But the training they got at Quantico wasn't very good at all. It certainly wasn't very modern. They did a lot of bayonet training. They bayoneted straw dummies of Germans along Chapawamsett Creek. They picked up rocks, and they pretended they were grenades, and they threw them. And they practiced this strange tactical doctrine, which they called musketry, which I alluded to before, which basically meant our line of riflemen will advance and shoot as a fire unit under the command of a company commander. And the second in command of the 6th Marine Regiment, one of the 2 regiments that goes to France, is this guy, Harry Lee. And Harry Lee writes an article for a brand new magazine called the Marine Corps Gazette about musketry. And the way he describes musketry is the attack must be machine-like. Riflemen must look to their target in order that on arrival at their position, their bayonets may pierce that at which they have been firing during the advance. That is a very strange way to describe tactical doctrine, but what you have to understand is the Marine Corps envisioned its rifle companies operating like its recruit platoons do here on the depot, as machines that are all responding to a single order from a single commander. It's not a thinking team that's problem solving and using mission tactics and fire and movement innovation. It's a machine. Its watchword is precision and discipline, and its operating principle is marksmanship. Now what these patches, these shoulder patches represent are the 28 American divisions that saw combat in France in the First World War. The 4th Marine Brigade, which was the part of the Marine Corps that actually saw fighting against the Germans, was one of the infantry brigades assigned to the 2nd Division. That's the Indian Head Division, the second one from the left in the top row. And what I want to do is give you an idea of the size of the Marine Corps' contribution compared to the rest of the country. So each one of those 28 divisions had 12 infantry battalions. The 5th and 6th Marines comprised only 6 of the 336 U.S. infantry battalions that fought in the Great War. Another way to look at it is those 6 battalions comprise the 4th Marine Brigade. A U.S. brigade is about the size of a French or a British division. The 4th Marine Brigade was one of about 229 equivalent-sized Allied units on the Western Front in 1918. I showed you this to make you understand that World War I was very important to the Marine Corps, to who we are as an organization, to who these guys are, what they went through. But we can't exaggerate the contribution of the Marine Corps' victory in World War I. In retrospect, in hindsight, in comparison, it was a very tiny piece of a very big picture. All right. Now, I talked before about how the Marine Brigade was part of an Army division. What you see here is the 4th Marine Brigade. It's one of 2 infantry brigades in this division. The 3rd Infantry Brigade is an Army brigade. The Artillery Brigade is an Army Artillery Brigade. There's 2 Marine regiments, the 5th and the 6th. There's also an entire machine gun battalion. Total strength is about 8,100 Marines. Total division's a little over 20,000 guys. Now I want to talk through supporting arms. Remember I talked before about how the Marine Corps is really a rifle-centric organization? There are supporting arms. There are organic cruiser weapons, but there's not a lot of them. They're all heavy. They're pretty good, but they're all heavy. So first off, automatic rifles. The one in the top picture here, that's a show automatic rifle. French design. There's only 192 of them in the entire 4th Marine Brigade. Whereas today, the same 2 regiments, the 5th and 6th Marines, could field about 486 infantry automatic rifles. For machine guns, they had a very good Hotchkiss gun, French design. They would employ 72 of them, the rest were spares. Today, the 5th and 6th Marines would field about 108 M240 Golfs and about 48 heavy machine guns, so a good deal more. For busting up bunkers and strong points, back then, they had the 37 millimeter gun. But back then they only had 3 per regiment, or 6 total. Today, we've got 54 shoulder-launched multi-purpose assault weapons in the 5th and 6th Marines. For rifle grenades, they had a bullet trap grenade that would stick over the end of their muzzle, but they only had 8 launchers per platoon, which gave them 192 for the brigade. Today we've got about 486 M203s in the same 2 regiments. And mortars. So they had the 3-inch Stokes mortar. If you were an 0341 like I was a long time ago, you might pick up that, hey, there's no sights and there's no aiming stakes on this mortar. That is right, they didn't use them. But back then they only had 6 per regiment, or a total of 12 for the brigade. Today, we've got 48 81 Mike Mikes, I think, and 54 60 Mike Mikes in the same 2 regiments. So what does all that mean? All that means that today, a battalion commander has a lot more tools in his toolbox than they had back then. Back then, it was rifles and not a whole lot else. Now, they did have telescoped sights on some rifles. They called these guys snipers, but did not employ them as snipers. They really employed them as the way that you guys employ designated marksmen today. But they would score hits on Germans up to 1,200 yards sometimes. Artillery coordination was very difficult because they didn't have radios. They had radios down to the regimental level is all. They weren't very good. They were very heavy, and they were Morse code, not voice. So what they would do is they had to do all the coordination by telephone. But when you're moving, when you're in the attack, there's no telephones, so it was all by messenger or pigeon or pyrotechnics. So artillery liaison was all done at the division level. You didn't have forward observers down at the company level. You didn't have a fire direction team down at the infantry battalion level. It was all done at a very high level, so it all had to be done with scheduled fires. So when the Marines get to France, they have to learn, they have to adapt their pre-war training doctrine of musketry to wartime organization tactics and techniques. And so what they do is they study the French. These guys look like they've been through the grinder, and they have. The French know a thing or two because they've seen a thing or two. And the U.S. 2nd Division adapts French attack doctrine for trench fighting and makes that their offensive doctrine. And the way it works out is basically like this. So what you see here, this black right here, these black rectangles, each black rectangle represents a squad. This is a battalion in attack formation. 2 companies up, 2 companies back. Each company is 4 platoons on line. Each platoon is 4 squads in column. And the battalion would actually form up like this. It would be about 1,000 meters across and about 500 to 400 meters deep. The Germans have their trench line, their main line of resistance, their outpost zone with machine guns and forward observers in fortified positions. So the way the French had been able to gain some success in 1916 and 1917 is they would fire a rolling barrage across the front of the infantry battalion. And then the infantry would advance behind it, walking behind a rolling barrage that's advancing about 100 meters every 4 minutes. The idea being, I'm a company commander up front. I can't adjust artillery fire because I don't have a forward observer with radio to talk to the artillery battery. So everything's going to be scheduled ahead of time. But we've got a lot of artillery, we've got a lot of ammunition. We're just going to blow up everything in front of the advancing front line. And the riflemen, all they have to do is follow the explosions in front of them. The Germans will be suppressed. They'll be down underground in their underground bunkers until we're right on top of them. It works out great later in the war. It doesn't work at all at Belleau Wood. And a big part of what I'm going to talk about is why this technique didn't work out at Belleau Wood and why it cost so much. So right before Belleau Wood starts in June 1918. In May 1918, the Marines are going through their last little bit of training. And this is a quote from a training memorandum the division put out for this last period of training. It says, our troops will be drilled until mechanically perfect in taking up and advancing in the prescribed formations, after which all attack formations will be made pursuant to the specific tactical situation, and the operations of the troops will be accordingly adjusted. Commanders must abandon the principle that the way to the front must be blasted by the field artillery. So what it means is, we're going to keep the mechanically perfect formation of the French doctrine, but we don't think we actually need the accompanying artillery barrage that it's designed to work with, which is not a really good idea. Now this guy, Don Perez, he's one of those wartime volunteers I told you about. He joins up as a private from Detroit, Michigan, right after war is declared. By Belleau Wood, he's already a sergeant, because we have to promote somebody to sergeant. And in his memoir, he talked about this period, and he said, we continued to drill as we had from platoon to company formation. We were maneuvered from section column to skirmish line to wave formation, punctuated by an hour a day bayonet drill. Unfortunately, few of these dated maneuvers would fit the war we were entering, but I am sure the whole company could have drilled in their sleep. So that's his own take. And the reason this happened is because the plan had been the division was going to go through 3 months of training in France before it saw combat. A month of trench training, a month defending an actual trench on the front lines in a quiet sector to accustomize everybody to combat conditions, and then this final month of what they call open warfare training, where they're type of fighting they saw at Belleau Wood. But what happened was that all got truncated because they did their first month of trench warfare training, and that went fine. But they got extended an extra month defending the quiet sector. And so they only had about 2 weeks at that of open warfare training, and they didn't progress very far. The reason all that happened was what will get them to Belleau Wood. What happens in 1918 is that America has entered the war and is just starting to build up its troop strength in France, but Russia has left the war. Russia was one of our allies under the Tsar, but they had the Communist Revolution, and so they dropped out of the war, made a separate peace with the Germans. So now the Germans can take all those millions of soldiers that were fighting the Russians on the Eastern Front and bring them to the Western Front and try and knock the Allies out of the war before the American divisions are there in force and can tip the balance in favor of the Allies. So the Germans start to launch offensives on the Western Front. March 21 is the first one against the British. Succeeds massively, but does not knock England out of the war. A second offensive on April 9 still does not knock England out of the war. The Germans are still trying in 1918 to knock the Allies out of the war before the Americans can come to the rescue. So on May 27, they attack the French and carve out this bulge. And this is the offensive which culminates in the Battle of Belleau Wood. Now the Germans were not trying to defeat the French army. They did not have Paris as an objective, which a lot of the mythology about Belleau Wood talks about. What they were trying to do was draw French reserves away from the British so that they could then launch a fourth offensive against the British and basically set them up for a knockout blow. When we get to Belleau Wood, what's going on is this German 7th Army has been advancing to the southwest, and they've pretty much exhausted themselves. And now what they're looking to do is find a natural defensive position to consolidate their gains. That's all they're trying to do. So what you've got here is you've got the Germans have advanced this far, where the brown line is. This is the Marne River. So they've reached the Marne River in places. And then you have the Ourcq River, which feeds into the Marne River. So what they're saying is, hey, if we can get all the way up here to the Marne and the Ourcq Rivers, we'll have a really good natural defensive position, which we can defend with fewer divisions. That'll free up troops to go attack the British up north, right? All right, so that's what they're trying to do. And right here, if you can see my laser, is Belleau Wood. And that's about where their attack is reaching when the Americans, when the 2nd Division deploys into a defensive position. And one of the first actions that happens with the Marines is a defensive action. So in these fields right here, looking north, what you see in the distance is a place called Leathernecks Farm. It's near Belleau Wood, but it's not at Belleau Wood. And the 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines is deployed in the defense, 4 companies up. And the Germans start advancing towards them. And the Germans don't really know what's in front of them. So they're just moving troops in the open, trying to find out. They've been driving the French back, and the French have been disorganized, and they haven't been hitting very stiff resistance until they run into the Marine lines. And you get this guy here. This is Private John Winford. I think he's a sergeant at this point, but he's a machine gun squad leader. And the machine guns of the 6th Machine Gun Battalion open up on these Germans at great distance and wreak havoc on them. And along with them, of course, you have Marine rifle fire, the legendary marksmanship of the 4th Brigade, which is inflicting casualties from rifles at distances which the Germans are not really accustomed to at this stage in the war, because they've been fighting the British and the French, who have really been neglecting marksmanship as part of their basic training. You also have this guy. He's one of those wartime lieutenants that the Commandant recruited. He's a BMI grad named Lemuel C. Shepard. So Winford's leadership of his machine gun squads earns him a Silver Star during this action. Shepard's out with an outpost of about 12 riflemen. They're knocking off Germans, but they're taking incoming fire. Shepard actually gets shot in the neck, but refuses to be evacuated until he can pull all his Marines back from the outpost. He'll get wounded again 4 days later, and again refuse to be evacuated. Pretty stalwart guy. He's awarded the Navy Cross for his leadership there in 2-5 during the battle. So that all happened on June 3. So the line stabilizes, the Germans go revert over to the defense, and the Marines decide what we need to do is we need to drive the Germans out of Belleau Wood. Belleau Wood is a strong point, it's an evident approach, it's key terrain. It's not very big. It's about the size of the depot here. It's a wooded area with lots of rocks. But before we can attack Bellewood, what the Marines need to do is they have to secure a high ground finger. It's a north-south finger right here. Okay, you can see my laser. That's called Hill 142. So they're going to have 1st Battalion, 5th Marines start from this attack position at 5:45 in the morning on June 6th. And they're just supposed to attack and seize Hill 142 to basically secure the left flank of the brigade, so the brigade can then attack to the east of my map, which is where Bellewood's over in this area. Okay, so we're going to secure the left flank, okay, so the Germans can't come in behind our attack on Bellewood. This attack is set for 5:45. It's supported with a 30-minute artillery barrage. And the guy in the picture here is the battalion commander. That's Major Julius Terrell. And at 5:45 in the morning, Major Terrell is standing there in his attack position. The 30-minute artillery barrage is about over, and he's only got half his troops. Only 2 of his companies have shown up. Only 1 of his 2 machine gun companies has shown up. And he has to make a very difficult decision. Do you go or do you not go? I feel like Major Terrell doesn't get as much credit as he deserves, because in that type of position, you can be damned if you do and damned if you don't. You can be damned if you go and you can be damned if you don't go. And he decides to attack. I think in the Marine Corps in 1918, there was never any question in his mind. You follow orders until you get killed following them. But he attacks with just 2 companies and 1 machine gun company firing in support. He's a little bit lucky. This right here is a boundary between 2 German divisions. So the Germans haven't really coordinated their defense across his front very well. The American artillery does not fire that rolling barrage for Major Terrell like he had been trained to do earlier. So he doesn't have the suppressive effects for that, but the 15th Machine Gun Company provides pretty good supporting fire for him against the German machine guns. The attack's pretty bloody. A couple Marines distinguished themselves I want to talk about. So this is an aerial photograph of the same area. So the Marine objective is basically supposed to be right here. Something that the Marines suffer from, particularly in the early days of Bellewood, is A, they don't have a lot of maps. If anybody's got a map, it's only Major Terrell. None of the company platoon commanders, certainly not squad leaders, have maps. They also aren't really that good at land nav. Nobody sent these guys out into the woods to find ammo cans when they were young. So land navigation is not a very good skill for these guys. So we have a lot of guys getting disoriented. So the first guy, probably one of the outstanding Marine officers of the war, is Captain George Hamilton. Hamilton has the left-hand company, the 49th company, and he leads them in the attack. He loses all of his lieutenants in this attack. He loses a lot of his Marines, but through his own personal courage, determination, leadership, of yelling, screaming, kicking, and just because he had earned the respect of his Marines, he keeps them driving through the German machine guns. But they keep going, and he keeps going because he's disoriented. He's in the fog of war. He's scared. He's confused, and he's not sitting there taking a knee and looking at a map and looking at his compass, figuring out where he is. So in his account, he says, "I realized that I had gone too far, that the nose of the hill I had come over was our objective, and then it was up to me to get back, reorganize, and dig in. It was a case of every man for himself. I crawled back through a drainage ditch filled with cold water and shiny reeds. Machine gun bullets were just grazing my back, and our own artillery was dropping close. I was 600 yards too far front. Finally, I got back and started getting 2 companies together." Now, he's the senior man because the right-hand company, 67th Company, has lost their company commander and 4 of their 5 lieutenants and their 1st sergeant. But one guy who's still on his feet is this guy, Gunnery Sergeant Charles Hoffman. His birth name was Ernest Jansen, but for some reason he enlisted under an alias. Now this is from his Medal of Honor citation. Immediately after the company to which Gunnery Sergeant Jansen belonged had reached its objective on Hill 142, several hostile counterattacks were launched against the line before the new position had been consolidated. Gunnery Sergeant Jansen was attempting to organize a position on the north slope of the hill when he saw 12 of the enemy armed with 5 light machine guns crawling toward his group. Now put yourself in Gunnery Sergeant Jansen's shoes. You've got a small group of Marines with you. You see 12 Germans a short distance in front of you, and they have 5 machine guns. What would you do, Gunny? I tell you what I don't think I would do. I don't think I would do what Gunnery Sergeant Jansen did. Giving the alarm, he rushed the hostile detachment, bayoneted the 2 leaders, and forced the others to flee, abandoning their guns. His quick action initiative courage drove the enemy from a position from which they could have swept the hill with machine gun fire and forced them to withdraw their troops. That's a lot of courage. That's a lot of initiative. Speaks tons about the old Leathernecks, who were the core of the Marine Brigade at this time. All right, so now that Hill 142 is secured, is the main attack of the day, which is supposed to go at 1700 that afternoon on June 6th. June 6th becomes the bloodiest day in Marine Corps history up to the time. All the casualties from all the wars, all the way back to the Revolution, if you added all of them together, would not total as many casualties as the Marine Corps suffers on this one day. And part of the reason is because the attack actually doesn't go very well. The attack is only partially successful, and that's being generous. So Belleau Wood is the big green patch right here. The German line is the red. And what they're going to do is the Marine Brigade's going to attack with 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines from the west, and they're to secure the entire northern half of the woods. And 3rd Battalion, 6th Marines is going to attack from the southwest and secure the southern half of the woods. 2nd Battalion, 6th Marines is just going to conform its line so that there's no break in the line with 3-6. They're not really attacking, they're just straightening out the line. So that's the idea. So what do we have? We got about, between these 2 battalions that are attacking Belleau Wood, you got about 2,000 Marines. Well, American intelligence is very bad. They don't know where the German front line is, and they don't know how many Germans are there, and they don't know how many machine guns are there. But we know today that there were as many Germans defending Belleau Wood as there were Marines attacking it, which is not really setting them up for success. But because the 2nd Division believes that we don't need artillery to blast away ahead of the infantry, they're not going to have a rolling barrage. There is American artillery shooting. They're doing a great job doing counter battery fire against the Germans. They're isolating Belleau Wood for reinforcement. But the Germans don't need to reinforce Belleau Wood. They've got 2,000 guys in there with probably over 100 machine guns. And so 3-5 will begin the attack from up here at 1700 and 3-6 from down here. And part of the problem I'm going to show to you this way. So what you see here are all the commanders in the chain of command going down from corps to platoon. This is the French Corps commander who's in charge of this sector. His name's de Gout. This is the 2nd Division commander, Omer Bunde. This is the 4th Marine Brigade commander, General John Harper. This is the CO of the 6th Marines who's in charge of this attack. That's Albertus Catlin. This is the 2nd Battalion, 6th Marines commander, Thomas Holcomb. This is Donald Duncan, his lead company commander, 96th Company. And this is one of Donald Duncan's platoon commanders, 2nd Lieutenant Clifton D. Case. So de Gout issues his order at 3 o'clock on June 5. And Omer Bunde passes it to Harbord later that evening. But Harbord doesn't issue his order to 6 Marines until 14:05 on June 6. Part of the reason is he's totally focused on the early attack on Hill 142. And his staff doesn't really get oriented on the second part of the attack until June 6. So they delivered that by motorcycle courier back then to Colonel Catlin not until 15:45, who then 15 minutes later goes over the plain with Major Holcomb and Major Sibley, the 3-6 commander, who turns around 30 minutes later gives a verbal order to Captain Duncan, who 15 minutes later gives an order to Lieutenant Kate, says it was very sketchy and I didn't really know where we were, what we were doing, where we were going. But they started double timing right away because the time of attack was 1700 and they were a mile from their attack position. So the 96th Company gets in a column of twos and just starts running toward their attack position. When they go over the top, 3-5, the 3-5 remember is attacking from the west. This is what they see. One of the sergeants is one of those wartime volunteers. His name is Mervyn Silverthorne. That's him on the lower left. And here's his account of the attack. We started off in trench warfare formation, the only formation we knew. We moved toward Belleau Woods, which we could see at this high point. Nobody firing a shot. Bayonets fixed, moving in a low, steady cadence that we had been taught to move because, theoretically, a barrage is shooting in front of you, and you don't want to walk too fast, or you'll walk into your own barrage. Belleau Woods was teeming with machine guns. I mean, as just seemed that way, and nobody was firing a shot at these Germans. They had us inflated. The lieutenant and I stopped halfway across this ravine behind some cordwood to get our bearings. The lieutenant looked around and said, "Where the hell is my platoon?" Well, his platoon was mostly killed and wounded. There were 6 of us. Sergeant Silverhorn continued the advance, but he was shot in the knee and evacuated to an aid station. He left it later on to look for one of his buddies who he found dead in the woods. So that kind of describes how it's going for 3-5. Now there was a reporter from the Chicago Tribune named Floyd Gibbons. That's him in the lower right, who was embedded, and he accompanied the battalion commander across that wheat field. And he suffered the wounds you see there. He lost an eye and he got his wrist shot up. And his buddies back at the Associated Press, when they got his dispatch, thought it was his last dispatch. They thought he was dead. So it didn't go through the usual censorship that the AEF wanted it to. So this is what the headlines were when America woke up the morning after the attack on Bella Wood. U.S. Marines smash Hunts. So the Marine Corps gets an incredible amount of publicity for their action at Bella Wood. We haven't taken Bella Wood yet. It's not actually going very well, but Floyd Gibbons says the Marines are covering themselves with glory. And by the way, AEF, American Expeditionary Forces, censorship being what it was, said you couldn't identify any American units by name or number. So the Marines have been identified. None of the Army units that were fighting around this sector ever got identified by the press. So there was a lot of jealousy and hostility between Army officers and Marine officers during and after the war because of all the exaggerated publicity the Marines got for Bella Wood. So now we're going to shift to the very southern end of the battle and talk about the 2-6 attack. So the 2-6, remember, was not even supposed to really attack. They were just supposed to conform their movement to the 3rd Battalion on their left flank, who was supposed to be clearing Bella Wood. So when Captain Donald Duncan and his 96th Company formed on line, 4 platoons abreast, to attack, this is what they saw in front of them. This is the town of Barrage. Now, shortly after they stepped off, Captain Duncan, basically the witnesses said that the 96th Company's formation was as perfect as if they were on a parade. And it was pretty quiet as they marched out into this open ground, 4 platoons abreast, and they started wheeling towards the northeast. But the Germans opened up on them when they were about 600 meters here from this town in front of them. They opened up on them with machine guns and started bringing in artillery protected barrage in front of the town. Captain Duncan went down right away, shot through the gut with a machine gun burst. And the guy in the lower right here, James Robertson, a Mustang officer, was the second in command, and he takes command. The company's pinned down. The company drops to the earth as one. This whole idea of we're going to suppress the Germans with rifle fire from our 03 Springfields is not working. They can't tell where the German machine guns are necessarily, but they're certainly not going to suppress them with rifle fire. The attack is breaking apart. And First Lieutenant Robertson pulls out his .45, stands up in the middle of all this fire, walks in front of the 96th Company, waves his .45 and says, "Come on, let's go." And the 96th Company starts moving in short rushes towards Barrage. One of the reasons they were able to get into the town is Lieutenant Robertson's personal leadership. He gets into the town only with about 20 to 30 Marines, about 24 Marines they say, got into the town with them, actually went through the German barrage. He probably lost a lot of the way. Another reason is the guy in the lower left-hand corner. That's Sergeant James McClellan. He's an automatic rifleman with the 79th Company, which is the company that was falling behind Robertson's company. And he works his way up to the front line with his automatic rifle and engages some of these German machine guns at nearly point-blank range. It probably helps Robertson get his Marines a foothold in the town. Once they've got their foothold in the town, the Germans start to pull back. This is a picture of the inside of Barrage. And this guy, remember, Second Lieutenant Cates, he works his way up to the town. It's actually his platoon that Robertson is there within the town. Robertson turns those Marines back over to Cates because it's part of his platoon, and Robertson goes back to find the rest of the 96th Company and reinforce Cates. Cates proceeds to clear out the town, does a great job doing it for a guy who's only been in the Marine Corps for 14 months. Partly due to the fact that he's got some really sharp guys like Private Herbert Dunleavy working for him. Dunleavy sees a German machine gunner in the church steeple, kills him with a bullet shot to the head, takes over the German machine gun and fires it at the Germans, who retreat the rest of the way out of town. Cates consolidates his defense with 3 little squad positions and waits there until Robertson comes back in the 96th Company and the 79th Company comes up to reinforce it. Now, it's a really important success because even though the attack on Belleau Wood has fundamentally failed, the attack on Hill 142 has secured the left side or the west side of Belleau Wood, and by securing Barrage, we've now secured a strong point on the southeast corner of Belleau Wood, which will set the Marine Brigade up for follow-on attacks against Belleau Wood. But the Marines have suffered a lot of losses, the most in history up to this point, right? So they have to bring replacements in. And what the Marine Corps would do in anticipation of these heavy losses was they actually had already deployed replacement battalions to France. And a replacement battalion is basically an infantry battalion with somebody from every job position in it. So you had a battalion commander who's a major and on down. And so these three guys joined. The guy on the left you've seen already, that's John Thompson, who joins as a second lieutenant replacement officer in 1-5. That's Carl Brannon. He's wearing the uniform in that picture of a Texas A&M cadet. He was actually a cadet at Texas A&M, dropped out, enlisted in the Marine Corps. If he had gone into the Army, he probably would have got a commission as a second lieutenant. And the guy on the right is a guy named Elton Mackin, who shows up as a replacement in 1-5. An important footnote to this is all three of these guys were excellent writers and wrote memoirs of their service in World War I that we can read today. Now we have to still attack and clear Belleau Wood. I'm not going to bog this down with a whole lot of arrows and diagrams and everything. What I'll tell you is that on 10 June, the 1st Battalion, 6th Marines attacks from the south and get this far, but they don't breach the German main line. They don't breach the German main line because, again, they don't have the rolling barrage, and we still don't have a really good fix on where the German positions are because our land navigation and our maps and our intelligence are all still very faulty. So 1-6 really doesn't gain anything that 3-6 hadn't gained 4 days before. Okay, so then the next day, 2-5 attacks from the west, basically covering the same ground that 3-5 had attacked on June 6th, 5 days before. But they are fortunate in that they hit a seam in the German defenses where two units are linked up, and they were able to make it over to the east side of the forest. But there's this twilight zone effect of Belleau Wood. It's very difficult to land nav in there. It's smoky. The woods are all blown to heck. The maps don't really jive with what the terrain looks like. And the battalion commander of 2-5, Fritz Wise, is standing over here, and he can see Barrage, and he can see the village of Belleau up here, and he thinks he's looking at the village of Belleau and the village of Torcy over here, which are off the map. In other words, he thinks he's up here, and he's cleared Belleau Wood, but he's actually here, and he's got Germans coming in behind his position. All right, so during the next part of this, the next few days confused fighting, the Marines are trying to drive out the Germans and consolidate a line. And one of the guys that distinguishes himself is this guy here. He's a sergeant in the 1st Battalion, 6th Marines. He's a wartime volunteer, so he's only been in uniform, 14 months, right? And he's the battalion intel chief. And he and the battalion intel officer are out scouting, trying to figure out where's 2-5's right flank, are they linked up with 1-6? And they come across an outpost of Germans behind their lines. They get a scratch squad together of 2-5 Marines, lead them in attack and wipe out the Germans, interrogate a prisoner, find out about another German position which they attack and then wipe out as well. So Thomas does a really good job here for a guy that's only been in the Marine Corps 14 months. He's awarded the Silver Star for his action there. Now another thing that's going on in Belleau Wood during this time, it's a really grim fight, is even the guys that are in the rear, who aren't on the front line, are getting pummeled. Now one night, June 13, there's 2 companies from the 2nd Battalion, 6th Marines that are in a reserve position, and they're getting ready to move up and relieve 2-5 in Belleau Wood. And right as they're getting ready to move out, the Germans hit them with what they called a drenching bombardment. Now Marines had been exposed to gas before, but it was always just a little bit. So the Germans shot gas, you sounded the gas alarm, you put your gas mask on, you moved out of the area, and you cleaned up, and it was more or less a nuisance. It cost you a lot of time and effort, right? You didn't lose a lot of casualties. Not this time, because the Germans first hit them with a whole lot of high explosives. So what do? You jump back into your fighting holes. These guys all jump back into their fighting holes, and the HE keeps coming, so they can't leave. And then the gas starts coming, and it's mustard gas, so it's penetrating their clothing, it's blistering their skin, and they're wearing their gas mask, which pinched your nose closed back then, and it was a rubber tube stuck in your mouth so you couldn't talk. And the lenses weren't that clear to see out of either, and it's dark. So nobody knows what's going on. All they know is that they need to stay in their holes, and the mustard gas is starting to blister everybody's skin. And it ends up taking out 378 Marines from 2-6 that night, or basically 2 whole rifle companies. And it also takes out another 185 from 1-6, who's just north of them in Bellawood. Also, what happens is you have another one of these hardcore Leathernecks, a gunnery sergeant named Fred Stockman, and that's his picture there. Now, Fred Stockman was an interesting guy. He had fought in Nicaragua back in 1912. He'd gotten out of the Marine Corps for a while and was a firefighter in Newark, New Jersey. Came back in the Marine Corps, and he was on recruiting duty in St. Louis, Missouri when the war started. He was one of these recruiters that was screening out all these young applicants. One of the guys that recruiting station St. Louis recruited during this period was a guy who's in his platoon, a private named Barrett Mattingly. Mattingly is hit by one of these HE rounds. He's wounded, he's lying there, and Fred Stockham, the gunnery sergeant, runs over, picks him up in a fireman's carry, because he's a former firefighter, and starts to carry him to the aid station. Another HE round goes off, bang, right above his head, knocks both of them to the ground. Stockham gets up, finds Mattingly, and realizes, oh shit, Mattingly's gas mask was destroyed by that second round. Stockham takes his own gas mask off and puts it on Mattingly, puts him back in the fireman's carry, and carries him to the aid station a few hundred meters away. Goes back, I think without a mask, 2 more times and takes more wounded Marines from the 96th Company and gets them back to the aid station. All right, so we've all read, we all know about Marines from the Pacific in World War II and other places who have thrown themselves on a grenade to save their buddies. It's an unimaginable act of self-sacrifice and one that we all revere. But at least if you throw yourself on a grenade, at least it's over right then, right? For Gunnery Sergeant Fred Stockham, he suffered for 3 days with phosgene and mustard burns inside his lungs as he drowned in his own fluid until he finally perished after 3 days of his suffering. So I think if there's anybody that ever deserved a Medal of Honor in Marine Corps history, Fred Stockham's got to rank up there with one of the top ones, which he was awarded about 20 years after the war. All right, so what I don't want to do is I don't want to just make this a talk about arrows and movements and tactics. I want to talk about what it was really like for the guys that were there at Bellawood. People ask me, well, how bad was Bellawood? What was the suck factor? The suck factor was really high. Okay, so you had guys like Levi Emmerich, who was a private, one of these wartime volunteers. He wrote an excellent memoir after the war. He said, "We were covered with body lice, hungry and thirsty. We were bruised in body and soul, tired and weary, dirty and weakened by dysentery, that lousy, messy kind that requires lots of paper and sanitation." But we had none. There was human blood on our hands that had to go for many days before they could be washed. You had the battalion surgeons and the Navy corpsmen who were picking up casualties. One of the battalion surgeons wrote in his log, "The character of the wounds encountered here fall chiefly into the tearing, lacerating, crushing, and amputating types, accompanied by all degrees of fractures, hemorrhage, and destruction of soft tissue." And you had mental injuries. This guy, Romain Pete Benjamin, is a sergeant in 2-6. He says, "A high explosive burst near me and my nerves went snap. I shook and couldn't stop. I was ordered to leave the wood this morning. The trip back through the wood to Lucy was a nightmare. The dead, mainly German, lay in heaps. A shell struck a pile of bodies, and one hurling through the air struck me and threw me down. I crossed a great open field, always under fire, and arrived in Lucy at the Red Cross station almost crazy. The doctors tagged me gas and shell shock." And shell shock back then is what we call post-traumatic stress disorder today. Benjamin didn't get evacuated. 2 hours later, Benjamin ripped off his evacuation tag, walked out of the aid station, and rejoined his company in Bellawood and stayed with them for the rest of the battle. So finally, on June 23, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines is in the front line, and they got the Germans boxed in a little 600 square meter toehold in the northern edge of Bellawood, and they go over the attack on June 23 again with no artillery support, and again fail to dislodge the Germans. So they catch their breath, And on June 25, 2 days later, the 2nd Division allocates a 14-hour artillery barrage on this small German position in the north end of Belleau Wood. So the Marines are finally getting the artillery support that World War I armies traditionally accept as mandatory for a successful attack. And the attack goes swimmingly well. Most of the Germans don't even fight back. They just surrender when the Marines run across their positions because they're out of their minds, the ones that are still alive. And you get guys like this. This is Private Henry P. Leonard. He's a company runner in 3-5. He got lost when he was trying to get a message to his company commander, and he was taken prisoner by the Germans. And the German officer is interrogating him, and he asks him, well, what unit are you with and who's out there? And Leonard bullshits him. Leonard says, oh, well, you're surrounded by the entire 5th Marine Regiment, and the 6th Marine Regiment is in support, and they're going to follow up with another attack in just a few minutes. So this German officer, and allegedly this is a true story, surrenders himself, 3 more officers, and 79 soldiers to Leonard. He marches them back to the 2nd Division Military Police prisoner collection point with just his pistol. But he was awarded the Silver Star for this action, so it probably really happened. And after that attack, the battalion commander for 3-5 is able to send a message back to brigade that says Belleau Woods is now U.S. Marine Corps entirely. But the battle's not over. They still have to hold what they got. So that night, the 2nd Battalion, 6th Marines is once again moving up to relieve 3-5. And at this little place that I've marked on the map is where 2-6 enters the woods. 3-5 is up here on the northern edge of the woods. And the 79th Company is moving into that position in the middle of the night. And as the column hits the wood line, the column starts to bunch up right there at the edge of the woods, which is a dangerous predicament. And the Germans choose that moment and that place to drop another trenching bombardment. So they hit the front of the column right away. The company commander, Captain Zane, is killed. The first sergeant, the guy in the upper left-hand corner, is badly wounded, and he ends up dying of his wounds a few days later. So you have this guy, Second Lieutenant Gravesby Erskine, is now in command. He's he's a company commander now in a very difficult situation. They're all pinned to the ground. They're in danger of being hit by shells and gas, just like the 78th and 96th companies were a few nights before. And according to Erskine's own account, this guy, Gunnery Sergeant Bernard Fritz, who's now the ranking non-commissioned officer, walks up to him, stands at full attention, salutes him, and says, Lieutenant Erskine, you are in command, sir. What are your orders? And he pulls Erskine out of his funk. Erskine pulls Fritz down to the ground and says, you need to take cover. But there's, shortly thereafter, according to Erskine, a lull in the bombardment. Enough of a lull that Fritz and Erskine get on their feet and get Marines on their feet and start moving them out of the impact area and down the road north through the woods to Belleau Wood. Fortunately for them, coming the other way is Second Lieutenant Jack West. He was an All-American football player from the University of Michigan and joined the Marine Corps after we declared war. And when the bombardment started, he grabbed a couple of his Marines when he saw that the company commander and the guides were down, went up to 3-5, found the company they were supposed to relieve, got a couple guys from 3-5, ran them back down through the woods, linked up with Erskine and Fritz, who were bringing the company up, and lo and behold, the 79th Company was able to relieve the company they were supposed to on time, and it only lost 16 casualties in this bombardment due to the leadership of these 3 guys who were able to survive. One of the reasons I point out Barber is Barber only had 18 months in the Marine Corps. He was a company first sergeant. It gives you an idea of the manpower decisions the Marine Corps is making at this point. Fritz, on the other hand, he'd been a Marine for about 9 years and had been the first sergeant previously, but it was an acting role, and he and the company commander had a falling out. So what was the cost of all this? Okay, well now Belleau Woods is a U.S. Marine Corps entirely, and we're not giving it up. We've lost 4,298 casualties, 665 guys of those killed. And this is not the end of the war, this is just the beginning. For the 4th Marine Brigade, that's Belleau Wood, June, July of 1918. Battle of Soissons, 1,632 wounded, 200 killed. Saint-Mihiel, 613 wounded, 81 killed. Blanquemont, 2,016 wounded, 292 killed. And the Argonne, 1,233 wounded, 185 killed. That's a lot of casualties for an organization that starts with only 8,100 guys. In fact, if the 4th Brigade had started with 8,100 guys and never received a single replacement and never had a wounded Marine return from the hospital, by the end of the Argonne, they would have been down minus 2,432 guys. So if you were a private in the 4th Marine Brigade before Bella Wood, you were definitely a fugitive from the law of averages and making it through the armistice unhurt, which is why we had that picture of only 32 guys from the 79th Company at the end of the war. So what does the Marine Corps have to do to adapt to this? Well, one of the things that they start doing is they start commissioning NCOs. In fact, before the Marine Corps ever went into combat in 1917, the Commandant issued Marine Corps Order number 25, and it said that no further appointments of civilians to the rank of second lieutenant, and all vacancies will be filled by meritorious promotion of non-commissioned officers. And in fact, 164 second lieutenants were appointed from the 4th Marine Brigade. They only had a table of organization that authorized 154 lieutenants. So basically, they promoted enough corporals, sergeants, gunnery sergeants to the rank of second lieutenant, like these guys. The guy on the left, that's John Winters. He was that machine gun squad leader at Le Marais Farm and 81st Machine Gun Company. The guy on the right, that's Gunnery Sergeant Fritz, the one that told Lieutenant Erskine, "You're in command, sir." These guys are both made second lieutenants after Bella Wood, and will be platoon commanders. Fritz will lose a hand in the next battle. He medically retired, but Winters makes it through to the end of the war. Okay, so that's the type of thing that the Marine Corps is doing. We're saying, but we've got the quality manpower to do it, remember? Because all those wartime recruits we got, those were quality guys. Okay, they weren't the bottom guy on the draft like the Army's doing. So we've got a lot of really good, strong potential leaders because we recruited high quality individuals at the beginning of the war. Here's another thing the Army actually has to do, the Marine Corps goes along with it, is upon going into action, 20% of the commissioned and enlisted personnel of each infantry regiment and machine gun battalion, taken prorated from the different grades, will be left out of action. We're going to take 1 in 5 of every one of our Marines and leave them out of the battle. Why? Because when we come out of the battle, that may be all that's left of that unit. And we need to rebuild with replacements around veterans so we're not going into each action as a brand new green outfit. That's the type of drastic personnel actions that the Americans are taking in order to fight this long war of attrition. You also get a new commanding general in the 2nd Division, and he's a Marine. His name's John A. Lejeune. And he has such a solid reputation both within the Marine Corps and in the U.S. Army that the Army gives him a 2-star Marine general command of one of their divisions. It's the one that has the Marine Brigade, of course. And he's a very insightful guy. So after the Battle of Soissons, the 2nd Division has about a month break, a little bit more before its next battle. And he begins an intense period of retraining where they take their experience from Bella Wood and Soissons and they adapt their tactics and they develop their leaders to deal with the situations a little bit more intelligently. And what he says to his division is require your subordinates to dispose their troops in accordance with the situation, discuss the exercise with officers and NCOs with the view to developing the best method. The adaptation of normal methods of attack or defense which limit the use of troops to fixed formations is prohibited. So he's fundamentally understanding what went wrong in Bella Wood and Soissons, and he's trying to fix it. Remember this guy, Harry Lee, wrote about musketry in the Marine Corps Gazette. He's now the CO6 Marines because Colonel Catlin was shot at Bella Wood. So he's now taken charge. He's now a full colonel. And he's learned his lessons too. After Blank Mont, he tells the division, experience has taught that pure infantry against wonderfully prepared machine gun positions, such as we have encountered, is too costly in casualties, and that a thorough shaking of the morale of the defenders by harassing fire and heavy bombardment directed on the nest area is the best and cheapest means of their reduction and capture. So those are great examples. The whole American Expeditionary Forces, but particularly the Marine Brigade, is getting a lot better. And by the end of the war, they're using tanks. They're integrating those rolling barrages into their attacks. They're better at scouting and patrolling and collecting intelligence. They're using aerial reconnaissance before an attack to figure out where the Germans are. And the staff work has gotten much, much better. Now they do one thing, I'm gonna ask to borrow the Springfield again, which is not such a great idea that they train the Marines to do. which is called marching fire. And the idea of marching fire was the Marines would advance on the line behind the rolling barrage, and they would work the bolts of their rifle and fire from the hip ahead of them as they marched. Kind of like the assault fire technique I saw 0311 spot when I went to infantry school in 1981. It's stupid. It was stupid in 1981, it's stupid in 1918, but they were trying to come up with something where the troops could keep moving behind the barrage and put out some sort of suppressive fire in front of them, which was very difficult to do. And of course, the ugly was the 20% Cadre that they were leaving out of every action. That's 1/5 of your combat power. That's a big risk, but they felt it had to be done. Another thing I want to talk about, though, is what the legacy of Bellawood means to us as an institution. So I talked about Sergeant Merwin Silverthorne, right? He was a wartime volunteer. He was a sergeant in 3-5. He was wounded on June 6th. Okay, Merwin Silverthorne fought in Haiti, and he fought in the Pacific in World War II as a general, and he retired as he was assistant commandant of the Marine Corps from 1950 to 52, and then he came back here to MCRD San Diego and was commanding general here until he retired in 1954. All right, this guy, Sergeant Thomas, he was the battalion intel chief for 1-6, awarded the Silver Star. He's commissioned before the war ends. He also fights in Haiti after the war. He's with the First Marine Division on Guadalcanal. He's the commanding general of the First Marine Division in Korea, and he's the assistant commandant of the Marine Corps from 1952 to 1954. This guy, Clifton B. Case, the second lieutenant that took the town of Barrage. All right, he's a company commander by the end of the war. He's the CO of the First Marine Regiment on Guadalcanal. He's the commanding general of the 4th Marine Division on Iwo Jima, and he's commandant of the Marine Corps from 1948 to 1951. Remember Lemuel Shepard got shot in the neck there at Levi Farm, was awarded the Navy Cross. He goes on to be the commanding general of the 6th Marine Division on Okinawa and commandant of the Marine Corps right after Cates. Oh, and this guy, Graves B. Erskine, the one that Gunnery Sergeant Fritz saluted in the middle of an artillery bombardment. He goes on, he gets wounded badly at San Miguel, but he stays in the Marine Corps. He's the commanding general of the 3rd Marine Division on Iwo Jima. He's the commanding general of Fleet Marine Force Atlantic when he retires from the Marine Corps as a 3-star, and he goes on to be Assistant Secretary of Defense under Dwight Eisenhower for Special Operations for 8 years. All right, what's the point of all that? The point is that the guys that we recruit today and the guys that we put through recruit training today or officer candidate school, we're not just doing that because we need privates and second lieutenants. Because the privates we recruit today and the second lieutenants we recruit today, they're going to be our institutional leaders 20 and 30 years from now. And we need to make sure that we're getting the right people in the door as well as training them the right way. So when you look back at these guys and they're looking back at us, what are some of the lessons from Bellawood that make it matter to us today? I'll tell you what my hypothesis is. First and foremost, we have to expect to adapt. So no matter what your tactics and your techniques and your procedures are that you've been trained in your job, when you go into the next war, you need to expect to adapt those to the war you're facing because they're going to be based on the last war you fought. And in order to do that, you don't just want Marines who can follow orders. You want Marines who can solve problems. So you have to develop problem solvers. I'm not saying that every recruit on graduation day needs to be instilled with anything besides an incident-willing obedience to orders. That's what you want from recruit training. But once they leave the grinder after graduation, we need to start developing these guys to think, to improvise, adapt, and overcome. Along with that, this basic combat tactics is you need to know how much firepower is really enough to suppress the enemy. Because they definitely didn't have that figured out at Bellawood, but they did by the end of the war. It's hard to figure out without going through combat experience and actually seeing how much artillery fire, how much machine gun fire, how much rifle fire by how many guys is it going to take to keep the other guys' heads down so that you can safely maneuver against them. And then gas and bugs. I talked about how chemical warfare destroyed 2 companies and almost destroyed another at Bellawood. I didn't talk about the flu epidemic, but an influenza epidemic actually brought the 4th Marine Brigade to its knees in the Argonne. I didn't even count those in the casualty figures, but they were down to about 20% strength. Everybody else was sick and evacuated. It was a pandemic of global proportions, killed as many people as the war did. Okay, why do I put that up here? Because it's a paradigm shift. The entire understanding of the nature of the conflict shifted under their feet when they got hit with a drenching bombardment at Bella Wood, or when they got hit with an influenza epidemic in the Argonne. So you're going to be pretty well prepared for the fight you expect, but you also have to prepare for the fight you don't expect. We are who we recruit. The generals who took us through World War II were the sergeants and lieutenants that took us through Bella Wood. The guys you recruit and the guys you train here at the depot today are going to be the guys that take the Marine Corps through the next 40 years. Slaying sacred manpower cows. There were manpower decisions the Marine Corps had to make in wartime that I don't think we would make today. There are peacetime manpower policies that make all the sense in the world to us today that may have to be thrown out the window, as fair and equitable as they are, for the needs of the Marine Corps in the future. And lastly, I think the enduring lesson here of the 4th Marine Brigade is that well-led Marines can endure a lot more than we may give them credit for. And I think these guys have shown that in abundance. Okay, a lot of you are probably, well, let me back up a little bit. This is a picture of the original cemetery at Bella Wood. And about 10 years after the battle, this guy, Second Lieutenant Jack West, the guy who helped Gunny Fritz and Lieutenant Erskine save the 79th Company that night, went back there. I've talked to Jack West's son. He said his dad probably suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder. He was a very brave guy. He was a company commander of Blank Month and was nominated for the Medal of Honor awarded the Navy Cross for his leadership there, but he was also hit in the head, shot in the head by a machine gun bullet, and suffered for years after. So about 10 years after the war, he went back to Bella Wood and he walked around it and he wrote a very gripping narrative, about 10 pages long, which hasn't been published, about his revisiting the battlefield. And as he walked around the battlefield, he talked in very graphic detail about his experiences there, and they were not pretty. And it's a very grim read, but I drew upon it a little bit from my book because it's a very honest retelling of his eyewitness account of the battle. And he concludes his little 10-page letter by saying, after Bella Wood, war for us became largely a business. Men just numbers, changing constantly, but here, men were living things, personalities, friends, and here, many of those friends gave all they had. And it's for those reasons that we want to remember and not forget the guys and the sacrifices and what they endured and the valor they exhibited at Bella Wood. I think some of you are probably thinking that you might want to go visit Bella Wood. I know Colonel Russo's been there a record 7 times, I think it's more than anybody I've ever met. If you go, a couple things. First off, on the left-hand side, what you see is the cover of a new book the Marine Corps History Division's put out. It's a battlefield guide written by Colonel Bill Anderson. He did a wonderful job. The maps in it are the maps that I used in my presentation. They are incredibly well done. The book's free. You can get a hard copy, you can get an electronic copy, but it's a wonderful book. So get yourself a copy of that if you ever have the opportunity to go to Bella Wood. It's only about an hour's drive from the Paris airport. Also get yourself a guide. If you're going to go through the trouble and expense of going to Bella Wood, get yourself a guide. And the best guide is the guy holding the gas mask here. His name's Gilles Legin. He's got his own Facebook page, GILLESLAGIN. He is one of the few civilians that's been made an honorary Marine by the Commandant of the Marine Corps because of his leading tours there at Bella Wood. He's also got a private museum where he'll show you a lot of cool stuff that he's dug up. I can't promise you that he'll find you a gas mask like he did for this guy, but you'll see a lot of cool stuff and you'll learn a lot of cool things, and it'll definitely be worth your time and effort. And you're also going to want to, whether you get to go there or not, you're going to want to read more about Bella Wood, I hope. So I've thrown up here 8 of some of the titles you might want to consider. George Clark wrote Devil Dogs, The History of the Marine Corps, World War I. Did all the research over 40 years. George was a World War II veteran himself, a great historian. Pretty much everybody that's ever written a book about the Marine Corps, World War I, relies on his research from Devil Dogs. He also wrote this book, Devil Dogs Chronicle, which is a compilation of the best eyewitness accounts by Marines from that war. So both those books are really well worth picking up. This book just came out, Among the Ranks of the Carrion Men, by Kevin Selden. Kevin's the best historian of Bella Wood that I know. He's a former Marine sergeant. This is the first of a 3-volume history on the Battle of Bellewood that he's writing. It's full of details you'll never find anywhere else. It's a great read. Suddenly We Didn't Want to Die is the best eyewitness account. Corporal Mackin earned the Navy Cross in World War I. He was in 1st Battalion, 5th Marines. He was one of those replacements I showed you. His book compares very favorably to Sledge's with the old raid at Peleliu and Okinawa, if you've read that about the Pacific War. Robert Asprey, former Marine captain, wrote At Bellewood. It's a history of the Battle of Bellewood. It's very good. Don Paratus was that sergeant in 2-6 who talked about the training and the tactics. He ended up getting all the way through the war, left the Marine Corps as a gunnery sergeant after less than 2 years service. Paratus wrote that book and said, I'd like all the money from this manuscript to go to a scholarship foundation. So if you buy that book, it's only like $12. All the money goes to the Marine Corps Scholarship Foundation, or all the royalties do. And then Through the Wheat, it's a history of the Marine Corps in the First World War, written by General Simmons and Colonel Alexander, 2 outstanding Marine Corps historians. It's a really good first book about the Marine Corps in World War I. Too limited of thirds, that's my book, it's outstanding. But I think it's going out of print, so you may not be able to find it. All right, so that completes my presentation. I know I've been talking on and on and on. Believe me, I can talk on and on and on about World War I, and I'll never get tired of it, but you'll get tired of me listening. So I'm going to stop talking here and invite your